So, got kind of a special sermon today. I think Ariella is going to be in here for it. Huh? Oh, she's back. Oh, okay. So I'm going to take a break from Genesis until next year, and Ariella came to me in a way that only Ariella can, and she's like, "Dad, you know what you should do?" She's like, "Maybe I should tell you some stories from the Bible, and then you should preach on it to the church." It was almost her exact words verbatim. So I was like, okay. So she picked 2 stories to share. Well, actually 3, but one of them was Jesus' birth. So I told her I was going to save that for later because we're coming up on Christmas. And then she picked 2 stories, and then I'm going to mix it with one of my favorite chapters, Luke 12. So this will be kind of a one-off, but it might not be the last sermon I get from Ariella. She's been wanting me to do this for a little while, so I thought this would be a good time to do it. So if you want, go ahead and turn to Luke chapter 12. And Luke 12, like I said, is one of my favorite chapters in the Bible. Not only is it in the greatest book in the Bible, but it's a great chapter full of, it's just got a lot of really practical wisdom, a lot of really, some vivid stories that are hard to forget, some amazing promises. I've gotten a lot of encouragement from this chapter in my life. So we're just going to take it one verse at a time and kind of work our way through it. Not the whole chapter today, but yeah, and then I want to try and tie in the stories that Ariella had, and we'll see how it goes. So we're going to start in Luke 12, verse 1 through 3. It says, "In the meantime, when so many thousands of people had gathered together, that they were trampling one another, he began to say to his disciples first, 'Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Therefore, whatever you have said in the dark shall be heard in the light. What you have whispered in private rooms shall be proclaimed on the housetops.'" It's cool to me that Jesus, there's this huge crowd there, and Jesus, during this moment, begins to preach a sermon to his disciples, the ones that are right there with him. And the first thing he says is, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." So, there were times, Jesus kind of went through extremes in his popularity, right? Like there were times like this, when he's got 5,000 people listening to him, when he feeds the 5,000, or he's got so many people that he's got to get out into a boat, or right here, people are trampling each other. It's like Black Friday, to hear Jesus. And then there's other times where people are like really, like literally trying to throw Jesus off a cliff, or they pick up stones to stone him. It's like he went back, and then ultimately he was crucified, of course. So he went back and forth in the popularity. And just from this first verse alone, something that I've kind of gotten that stuck with me is, you can't always look at how people receive your ministry to decide whether it's pleasing to God or not. Because in each of those situations, whether Jesus was popular or not, he was pleasing to God. It's just people received it sometimes favorably and sometimes not, And I just think that's interesting. That's been encouraging to me, because ultimately we just need to obey God and leave the results up to him. Sometimes people are going to love you when you do what God says, and sometimes they're not, But either way, the important thing is that we do what God says. I think it's important that we're not jerks about it, doing what God says. Some people are like, well, I just speak the truth, And that's just their excuse to be a jerk. And we don't need to be jerks for Jesus. We just need to obey God and leave the results up to him, But we can try and do it in a nice way. Anyways, I thought that's a little thing that stands out to me. So Jesus is in a popular time right now. A lot of people really like him. And the first thing he tells his disciples is to beware of hypocrisy. They see all these people out here, all these people want to hear Jesus, all these people are looking to him, and he says to them, beware of hypocrisy. In some ways right now, Jesus is like a celebrity, he's a celebrity rabbi. Everybody wants to be around him. And something I've noticed personally, and maybe you have too, I think this is true in life, but I see this especially in ministry, is like, There's a tendency to drift toward hypocrisy when you're on top, when everybody's looking at you. What I mean is like, hypocrisy is pretending to be something you're not. And I don't think it always starts out huge, but when everyone's looking at you as the leader or the person on top, there's this pressure to pretend like you've got it more together than you might actually have it. There's a pressure not to look like you're struggling, not to look like you're having a difficult time at any moment, because you don't want to let people down. People have this image of you. They put you on a pedestal, and you feel this pressure. It's not a good pressure, but you feel it to like not let these people down, you know? And so you can begin to pretend that you're better off than you are. Things are okay when you're actually struggling. You don't want to let people in on that because you don't want to let them down. And then also, I think there's an allure, like when you're on top, when people are looking to you, you can kind of get addicted to that feeling of like people admiring you. And you don't want to lose that, you know? And especially in our day and age where you can make a career out of being a preacher or being in ministry, and you go through a hard season in your life and you've got all these people looking at you, you can tend to be like, well, I'm just going to handle it on my own. I can't tell anybody. I can't be honest. I can't be real. And that's why we find pastors who have been in ministry for years, and we find out there's a scandal, you know, they've been doing things behind the scenes. They began to become hypocrites. They didn't always start out that way, but somehow over time, that pressure of expectation and that allure of people's admiration, they caved into that and they began to be hypocritical, began to preach something that they weren't living anymore. It doesn't start out huge, it starts out small. And Jesus says you need to beware of that, because the Pharisees, they were the people who were the religious people on the outside. They preached all the right things, but inwardly, they were like ravening wolves, right? They would devour widows' houses behind closed doors. They would go out on the street corner and pray long prayers, and then behind closed doors, they denied mercy and justice and the love of God. And Jesus tells his disciples, don't do that. I wrote it down, don't ever let the pressure of people's expectations or the allure of people's adoration keep you from being genuine, from being real. You know, it's not easy to share our struggles. It's not easy to admit when you're in a tough season, especially when you're a leader. It's tempting to try and put on a facade to hold on to the praise of men. But Jesus says, especially for us as ministers, and you know, I'm relating it this way because this is the way it relates to me when I read it. As ministers, like, we have to constantly seek to be real and to be growing. That what we are preaching to y'all is authentic and not something that we're just putting on a facade, you know? One of the things I love about Scott is that he's always sought to be real, you know, from what I can tell. And even him coming and saying to the leadership team and to y'all, like, I need a sabbatical. I need some time to recharge. That takes a lot of vulnerability. It takes a lot of courage. But he was willing to do it because Scott wants to be real. He's not in this to make a lot of money. He's not in this to just get people's admiration. And that's the way we all should be. Like, there's a temptation to come to church and put on a facade because we don't want other people around us to think ways about us that we don't want them to think. Jesus says you need to beware of that. It's tempting to try and hold on to the praise of men, even though you know you're secretly hiding sin or you're secretly struggling. I think a question I have to ask myself as a minister, and we need to ask ourselves, is like, who am I really? Am I hiding anything? And do I hide it because I want people to admire me? Jesus says, it's better that we're honest and find healing now, because someday it's all going to be exposed. Everything that's been hidden is going to come to the light. And it's better to do it now and find healing than to try and do it later or than to have it done later when you're standing before God. It's better to be real now. And honestly, it doesn't always happen when you're standing before God. Sometimes it happens later on in life. You can't hide it anymore, and then everything just kind of falls apart, you know? I believe the fact that God is going to bring everything to light at some point is something that makes me, like, a question I've had before is, why would God be willing to give us this awesome privilege of responsibility and free will? Like, why would God allow us to make choice? Like, why would he give us a universe where we could positively or negatively impact it with our choices? Like, that almost seems irresponsible and idiotic of God to do something like that, to make creatures that had such capacity for evil and give us the ability to choose to do that evil if we want to. Why would God do that? And I think there's two reasons. One, because God, along with that responsibility, has given us everything we need to make right choices. So he didn't just throw us out here with no guide. Like, he gave us a conscience. He gave us direction. He's always done that. But in the end, the second reason I believe God's given us this responsibility is because in the end, God's going to work everything out. He's going to bring everything to light that's been hidden. And he's going to make everything right that's been wrong. And that's an awesome promise, because everything that's been done to us in the dark that hasn't been known, the way people hurt us, God's going to bring that to light, and he's going to make it right. I don't know exactly what that will look like, but it's also kind of a fearful thing, because everything we've done in the dark that no one knows about will come to the light as well. And so Jesus says, don't be a hypocrite. Don't hide so that you can have people's approval. Be real. Come out into the light and find healing. The next thing going on in verse 4 through 7, Jesus kind of continues on this vein of encouraging us not to be hypocrites, and he really tells us, don't be afraid of people, period. So look at what he says. He says, I tell you, my friends, don't fear those who kill the body and after that have nothing more that they can do. I will warn you whom to fear. Fear him who, after he has killed, has authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies, and not one of them is forgotten before God? Why, even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, you are of more value than many sparrows. This, ties in nicely to his first line about don't be a hypocrite. It's like, don't be afraid of what people think. Care more about what God thinks. And of course, these verses here go beyond just whether you're living in hypocrisy or not. Every decision we make should be motivated out of a desire to please God. I like this distinction that Jesus makes here. He says, if you got to choose between God or men, obviously you should fear God, right? Like, that seems pretty clear. All that people can do, the worst they can do is kill you. The worst that God could do is send you to hell. So if you're going to fear somebody, you should fear God. But what's cool is that when you choose to put God first, you're choosing a God who knows every hair on your head, who knows every sparrow that dies, who cares deeply for you. And so when you put God first, you don't have to be afraid anymore of anything. That's why he says, fear God, but then he says, fear not, in just the same breath. Because when you fear God, when you put him first, you don't have to be afraid of what anyone thinks or what anyone could do, because God cares for you more than many sparrows. The first story that Ariella wanted me to share was the story of the paralyzed man, the one that's on the mat, and Jesus is in the house, and all these people are inside the house, and these guys bring their friend on a cot, and he's paralyzed, and they can't get him inside. Nobody's going to let him in. They want to be near Jesus. And so, y'all know what they do. They get up on the roof, and they dig a hole in some random person's roof. And that's got to be a big hole. I mean, the guy's probably 6 feet tall. Maybe they're a little shorter back then, 5.5 feet tall. And he's on a bed with poles. And they dig a big old hole in this guy's roof and drop this man down in front of Jesus. And it just made me think about this, because surely they made somebody mad digging that hole in the roof, you know? And somebody's getting dirt falling on them. The owner of the house is probably like, what are you doing, you know? But they didn't let the fear of people keep them from doing what they needed to do for their friend to get to Jesus. They're like, we'll figure it out later. We'll come back and fix it later. I don't know, you know? But they weren't going to let the fear of people keep them from doing what was right. And that's the challenge I think we all face. Are we going to live our lives out of fear, or are we going to live our lives motivated by what God wants us to do? I heard it. This is a little bit different, but I heard this quote, and I thought it was worth sharing because it's kind of stuck out to me. I heard someone say once, everything you do is either motivated out of fear or it's motivated out of love. And that's a little bit simplistic. I'm sure sometimes both our decisions can be a mixture of both. But it made me think, you know, it's like, why am I stressed out about this situation? What am I afraid of? Why am I acting this way towards this person? Is it because I'm worried about what they'll think about me, or is it because I love them and I want what's best for them? You know, it's like every decision, why do I feel driven to make this decision? Why am I planning my life the way I'm planning it? Is it out of love, or am I afraid? Am I afraid of the future? Am I afraid of what will happen if I don't work everything out this way? We can be afraid of a lot of things, not just people, but all kinds of stuff. And why are we making our decisions? Is it because this is what we feel God wants us to do? We want to honor him and serve him? Or is it because we're afraid? We can make so many decisions because we're afraid. We want to control things. We don't want bad things to happen. We try and control everything. Jesus doesn't want us to live that way. He wants us to make decisions out of love for him, for others, for our family. We don't have to live in fear of the future when you have a God who knows every hair on your head. So he tells us, don't be a hypocrite. Don't be afraid of what people think. Don't be afraid of what people will do. And then he says, don't be afraid to confess me before people. So look at Luke 12, verse 8. He says, I tell you, everyone who acknowledges me before men, the Son of Man also will acknowledge before the angels of God. But the one who denies me before men will be denied before the angels of God. And something I see in this passage is that Jesus is constantly taking our eyes off of the temporal and making you look to the eternal. Because that's really the only motivation for why you would live differently in this world. Why shouldn't you be a hypocrite? Because everything's going to come to the light. Why shouldn't you fear men? Because God is the one that you have to answer to. And you'll stand before him someday. And why should you confess him before men? Because that is how he'll confess you before the angels. Now, Jesus isn't saying that all you have to do to get into heaven is say Jesus is Lord. Like, he talks about people who will go around saying, Lord, Lord, and they never knew him, you know? So there are people who confess Jesus on earth. Jesus is Lord, you know, and they'll even do miracles in his name, but he doesn't know them because they're hypocrites. They're not changed on the inside. But he is saying that a true follower of him, God is going to call his children to confess him somehow and in some way. And we shouldn't be ashamed of Jesus. We shouldn't be afraid to live our life for him in this world. So the second story Ariella wanted me to share, it's a two-parter. It's the story of, remember when there's a guy named Jairus and his daughter is sick, and he comes to Jesus and he says, Jesus, will you come heal my daughter? And so Jesus comes with him. But on the way, somebody touches Jesus and he feels power go out of him, which must be so cool. Like, I wish I knew what that was like, you know? Jesus is like, hold up. somebody just got some healing power out of me, Yeah, I guess he knew that. So anyways, and the disciples are like, Jesus, there's so many people around you. Like, everyone is thronging you. This is another one of his popular times, like, it could have been anybody. He's like, no, I know somebody did it. So there was a woman who had come and touched him. She was bleeding for 12 years. And an important part of this story is that back then, under the Old Testament law, bleeding constantly made you unclean. So for 12 years, she'd been unclean. And if you're unclean, you're not allowed to touch people. The things you touch become unclean, all of that. And so she was really kind of like taboo, like you don't want to touch this lady because then you're unclean. You can't go into the temple. I forget how it all works, but you got to become clean before. So it's kind of like, stay away from this lady. And she's up in the crowd touching everybody, trying to get to Jesus, and nobody knew she was unclean. Surely this is something she could hide, but she's got to get to Jesus. So she's just going in there, probably bumping all kinds of people trying to get there. She touches Jesus, and Jesus wants to know who touched him. So she comes out in front of everybody. She tells everybody what just happened, that she has been unclean for 12 years, and she got in the middle of this crowd and touched everybody just so she could get to Jesus, and that Jesus healed her. And I've kind of wondered before, like, why would Jesus put that lady in that situation? Like, that's an embarrassing thing to share with everyone. Not only the condition, but especially considering the circumstances. Like, it's embarrassing to admit to everybody that you've been unclean for that long and, like, you've just been around touching everybody. And, like, why would Jesus put her in that situation? And this is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I guess it's not totally a rabbit trail. Like, why does God call us to confess him in different ways? Why does God call us to share what he's done in our lives, even if it feels embarrassing sometimes, like the things we've been through? I think, number one, he wanted the crowd to be blessed because the crowd was surely amazed. But I think the most important thing, this is the thing that stands out to me, I think he wanted the woman to know that he was not ashamed or disgusted of her, that she touched him. Because when she looked at him, he called her daughter, said, go in peace. This is the thing to me that seems different about Jesus than all the other rabbis. I was talking with Justin about this the other week. Like, Jesus, why did all of the tax collectors and prostitutes want to sit with Jesus? Why did they want to eat with him? Because they didn't want to eat with the other religious teachers. Like, Jesus was a rabbi. People called him rabbi. Like, why would they want to sit with him? What was different about him than all the other religious leaders? Because he was telling them some of the same stuff they would have told him, probably, like they need to turn from their sin. Jesus told lots of people to turn from their sin, religious people and sinful people. He wasn't just like sin is okay, it's no big deal, and that's why they wanted to hang out with him. He told people, you need to turn from your sin. But why did they want to hang out with him and not them? And I think it's because simply because Jesus had compassion and he embraced people in love before he called them to change. Because those Pharisees told people to change, and they also emanated just complete disgust and disdain for these people. God, thank you that I'm not like other people are, like that Pharisee prayed. I'm not like this tax collector. But when people sat with Jesus, I think they really felt his love and compassion before they felt anything else. I tell you all this often. I listen to this channel called Soft White Underbelly, where these people of all different kind of walks of life will share their story. Drug addicts, prostitutes, and it's amazing when you really listen to someone's story, how judgment will go right out the window, But what's amazing for some of these people is this is the first time that somebody has just sat and let them talk and share their story, maybe in years, And And this guy who's doing the interviews, he doesn't claim to be religious, but these people will share and they'll break down. They'll share like the deepest parts of their life, because just because somebody created a space and said, I just want you to tell me what your life was like. No judgment. I'm not trying to fix you. I just want to hear, you know? And sometimes that's the catalyst for people to begin to change, is to be able to share their story. I was watching one the other day, this heroin addict, this lady who is addicted to heroin, and she shared her story and then found out it was getting a bunch of views on YouTube. And she said, I couldn't watch it for like 3 days, and I just felt sick because I just knew there's not going to be anything good out of this. You know, she shared some really difficult stuff, how she was on, you know, she got pregnant. She was addicted to heroin, so she was trying to get off, so she was on methadone while the baby was born, and people judged her for being on that. And she was trying to do it because the baby was born addicted to methadone, you know, and she's just breaking down like, she's like, this is the worst thing I've ever done to that I was on methadone while I was giving birth, you know? And she just felt terrible about it. But then when she looked at the comments, so many people were showing her love, and people were saying, I've been there, and your story has helped me on my journey to sobriety, because I'm struggling with heroin addiction too, you know? And she said that was a moment that changed her, because she realized like she wasn't just a drug addict, like she was somebody special. And that all happened because somebody was willing to listen to her. And that's the whole point I'm trying to get at, is like, I feel like maybe the reason people wanted to be with Jesus and not the Pharisees is because I bet he spent a lot of time listening. He spent a lot of time just letting people talk and share. When the woman caught in adultery came, when the Pharisees brought the woman caught in adultery and they want Jesus to condemn her, the first thing Jesus does is protect her from the judgmental, hypocritical religious institutions. He points the finger back at them and says, first one of you that doesn't have sin, go ahead and throw the stone. And just keeps writing in the sand. And we don't know if he was writing, but it was convicting. And they all walk away. And then he says, have none of them condemned you? I don't condemn you either. What an amazing thing for a rabbi to say to a woman who's just been caught in adultery. I don't condemn you. And then he says, go and sin no more. And that compassion and empathy preceded the message of change your life. And that was a big deal. And I think for us, like, that's an important thing for us to take away. When we interact with people out there who aren't in touch with God or the church, the first thing they need to hear from us and see from us is the empathy and compassion of God before they're going to be able to listen to what we have to say. Amen? But yeah, so like I said, that was a little bit of a rabbit trail. Let me share with you this quote that Katie, while we were talking about this week, she sent me a quote, and I thought it was pretty cool. I didn't get it on the slides, but I'll read it to you. It's from Brené Brown. I'm sure we have some Brené Brown fans. It says, if you put shame in a petri dish, it needs 3 ingredients to grow exponentially: secrecy, silence, and judgment. If you put the same amount of shame in the petri dish and douse it with empathy, it can't survive. I thought that was pretty cool. So, God calls us to confess the things that he's done in our lives. Confess him before men. And I hope we will have boldness to share what God's done, even if it's embarrassing sometimes. Because what you'll find is that God doesn't condemn you for your past. He loves you. And he has compassion on you. And then you'll also find that when you share, it blesses a lot of other people. And then I hope we can also be the kind of people who don't dump shame on others. So, we're going to wrap up soon. I want to read kind of a long passage with you, if you don't mind. This is one of my favorite passages in the Bible, and so I'm going to read it with you. We're going to skip a couple verses in Luke 12 because I don't want to get caught up in that. I want to get to this. So let's start in Luke 13. Joseph, y'all could advance the slides for me so that I don't get behind. I'd appreciate it. So Luke 13. Someone in the crowd, Luke 12, verse 13, sorry. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" I love that. People trying to drag Jesus into their affairs and get Jesus on their side, and Jesus is like, I don't have anything to do with that. And then he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them a parable saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' Don't give it to the poor, obviously. He said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.' And he said to his disciples, 'Therefore, I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. Life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? If then you are not able to do as small a thing as that,'" smallest thing as bend the space-time continuum and add time to your life, God's like, that's elementary stuff. If you can't even do something as small as that, why are you anxious about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink, nor be worried. For all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So in this passage, Jesus tells us, again, to have that eternal perspective. Don't put your faith in money, in uncertain riches. Put your faith in God. If you've had it all down here and you haven't served God with your riches, you're a fool. Because it's temporary, and also because stressing out about riches is unnecessary. God wants us to be free to serve him. And so he says, I'm going to really simplify it for you. You don't have to even worry about what you're going to eat or drink. All you have to focus on is seeking my kingdom and your role in it. What do I want you to do? Do that, and I will provide everything else. Has anybody ever seen a stressed out raven worrying about what it's going to eat? A raven that's got a can under one arm, throwing food in it, saving it for later. The ravens just wake up and trust that God's going to provide for them. Have you ever seen a flower sowing in the field, making a little coat? That's what Jesus is saying. It's like God takes care of these things. We just don't think he's going to take care of us. So the last story Ariella wanted me to share was with Jairus' daughter. You know, Jairus comes to Jesus. His daughter is dying. In the whole hubbub of the woman touching him and all of that going down, somebody comes and says, hey, Jairus, your daughter died. Don't bother the teacher anymore. And Jesus looks at him and says, don't be afraid, just believe. And that is what God wants us to do in this relationship with him, is to put him first. And don't be afraid of what people think. Don't be afraid of anything else. Just trust him. Do what he says. But it's hard to do. I mean, imagine how hard it would be for you to hear your daughter just died. And Jesus looks at you and says, don't be afraid. I mean, and that's what it is with us. It's like, I was telling Katie, like, man, some days I'm just really bad at trusting God, you know? Because when the pressure comes at you and things are stressful, you know, it's like my job, you know, is wanting us to, recently there was some changes and layoffs and stuff, and it's like, now they're wanting us to work a lot more hours, and that's not going to work with our ministry schedule, and, you know, yada, yada, yada. I'm like worried about it. And it's like, why am I worried? God is able to work these things out. He's always provided for us. All I have to do is say, God, what do you want me to do now? And just take it one day at a time. But it's hard. But of course, God did come through for Jairus. Everybody thought it was a lost cause, but God was able to work it out. He raised his daughter. I don't know if she was dead or not. Jesus said she was just sleeping, but he was able to work it out. And so that's a lot of what Luke 12 is for me, is to focus on God. Don't be a hypocrite. Don't be afraid of what people think. Don't be afraid to share what God tells you to share. Put your whole life around God's kingdom and ask God, what am I supposed to do for you? How do I live for you? Don't worship money. Don't worship people's approval. Just God, you know? Where your treasure is, that's where your heart will be also. Those are good encouragements for me, and I hope they are for you too.